Soft candlelight flickers across the walls of a small medieval village. The scent of wood smoke mingles with the morning dew lingering on cobblestone streets. Horses shift gently in their stalls, and distant church bells echo softly through the cool, misty air. Life moves slowly here, in rhythms forgotten by modern time. Welcome, dear listener, to another quiet evening with me. I hope you're nestled in your favourite blanket, the lights dimmed low, perhaps a soft fan turning gently above, carrying you toward a calm and peaceful night. Let yourself sink into your bed, breathe slowly, and let the day drift away. If you enjoy these gentle explorations into history, consider liking and subscribing, only if it feels right to you, and perhaps leave a little note in the comments telling me where you're tuning in from and what hour it is in your corner of the world. It's a small way to feel cosy and connected tonight. If you ever stepped out of a time machine and landed in a medieval village, the very first thing to hit you wouldn't be the sight of knights, castles, or quaint little cottages. No, it would be the smell. A powerful mix of smoke, animal droppings, unwashed bodies, and damp earth would greet your nose long before anyone said, "Welcome to the Middle Ages." So how did people stay clean back then? Well, the short answer is, with great difficulty. The long answer is this section. Let's start with water. Every village had some source, maybe a well, maybe a stream, sometimes just a muddy pond. That water wasn't reserved only for drinking. It was also where people did laundry, where women washed vegetables, and where cows, horses, and the occasional pig wandered in for a quick dip. If you thought, this looks a bit dirty, your neighbour would probably shrug and say, it's either this or nothing. Fetching water was its own daily workout routine. Women and children hauled heavy wooden buckets back and forth, sometimes dozens of times a week. Imagine carrying 2 sloshing buckets of water uphill in wooden shoes on a path that was basically half mud, half manure. Suddenly your gym treadmill doesn't look so bad. Bathing was another story. Forget the modern idea of a daily shower. A proper bath meant filling a large wooden tub with water, which took hours of bucket hauling and wood burning. So most peasants simply didn't bother unless it was absolutely necessary. Instead, they splashed their faces, rinsed their hands, maybe rubbed down with a cloth. A full-body soak. That was more likely reserved for a festival, a wedding, or the once-a-year moment when someone said, "You know, you're starting to smell worse than the pigsty." Clothes? Washed rarely. Wool tunics and linen undergarments might go weeks without a proper scrub. Soap was expensive, so many villagers used homemade substitutes like lye from ashes, or just plain water. The result was a village that smelled of sweat, smoke, and animals. But here's the thing. Everyone smelled the same, so nobody really noticed. In fact, if someone suddenly showed up smelling like roses, the villagers might be suspicious. And then there were the animals. Most peasants lived right next to their livestock, sometimes even in the same one-room house, separated only by a wooden partition. Chickens under the table, pigs out back, a cow or two in the corner, this was normal life. Naturally, all those animals left their mark. Waste was swept into the streets, where it mixed with rain, mud, and leftover food scraps. Children played in it. Adults tramped through it. Boots and hems carried it right back into homes. The medieval village was not a place where you'd want to walk barefoot. But before you imagine that everyone lived in a cloud of filth without a clue, remember this: cleanliness was relative. People did what they could. They washed vegetables, rinsed wounds, and tried to keep cooking tools clean. Survival mattered more than smelling fresh. To them, dirt was simply part of life, not a constant crisis. If you were a medieval villager, you probably didn't think of cleanliness the way we do today. For us, hygiene means soap, showers, and fresh laundry. For them, it was more about managing dirt than eliminating it. And yet, strangely enough, the Middle Ages did have a bathing culture, at least for those who could afford it. Public bathhouses existed in many towns, even if villages rarely had them. People went not just to wash, but to socialise, eat, and sometimes engage in activities that were, let's say, less about hygiene and more about pleasure. This is one reason the church began to frown on public baths. A bathhouse, one preacher complained, is the devil's playground. Which might have been true, but it was also the only place where a villager could sit in warm water without carrying 100 buckets first. Peasants, of course, had fewer options. A tub in the corner of a cottage might serve the whole family one after another. And yes, that meant the water grew murkier with each person who climbed in. If you were the youngest child, you were probably last in line, staring into a greyish soup of your siblings' dirt. Suddenly, being the baby of the family didn't sound so lucky. But even without regular bathing, villagers had their own small strategies. They combed their hair to pick out lice, sometimes using fine-toothed combs carved from wood or bone. They aired out their clothes in the sun to kill pests. They used herbs like lavender, rosemary or mint to mask smells, though most likely they just made the mix of odours even stranger. Imagine walking into a cottage that smelled like smoke, onions, goat, and a hint of rosemary. Not exactly the air freshener aisle at the supermarket. The church also played a large role in shaping ideas of cleanliness. Washing before prayer was encouraged. Monasteries often had rules about washing hands, faces and feet at certain times of day. But for ordinary villagers, cleanliness had a more spiritual meaning. Being pure of sin was more important than being free of dirt. You could have mud up to your knees, but if you had confessed and prayed, you were clean in the ways that mattered. And yet, for all these compromises, medieval villagers were not clueless. They noticed patterns. They knew that bad water made people sick. They understood that wounds healed better if washed. They even linked foul air, what they called miasma, to disease. Their explanations weren't always scientifically accurate, but they weren't living in complete ignorance either. They simply had fewer resources to fight against the endless cycle of dirt. So, between smoky cottages, muddy lanes, and questionable bathwater, the medieval villager did what they could. Hygiene wasn't about sparkling skin or pearly white teeth. It was about surviving without letting the mess of life overwhelm you. If you thought medieval villagers were just casually strolling through their messy lives, think again. When disease arrived, and it often did, suddenly everyone became very interested in cleanliness, or at least their version of it. The most feared, of course, was the plague. Imagine a village of a few hundred people, and within weeks half of them are gone. Hygiene, in those desperate moments, was not about smelling nice. It was about survival. People believed that foul smells carried sickness, the infamous bad air or miasma, so they burned herbs to purify the air. Villagers stuffed their homes with juniper, lavender, or even onion skins, hoping to chase away disease. Doctors in towns wore those odd bird-beaked masks stuffed with herbs, and though villagers didn't have those costumes, they shared the same logic. If it smells strong, maybe it keeps the plague away. Waste management also became more serious during outbreaks. Villagers dug pits outside the walls for refuse. Bodies of the dead were buried quickly, sometimes with lime to reduce smell and infection. Imagine the local gravedigger suddenly becoming the busiest man in the village. It was grim, but necessary. Hygiene here was as much about keeping the village functioning as it was about keeping individuals clean. Still, daily habits didn't change overnight. Villagers couldn't invent plumbing or invent antibiotics. They did what they could, washed hands more often, avoided bad water, burned more fires to clean the air. Some believed frequent bathing actually opened the pores and let in disease, so ironically during plague years people often bathed even less. That meant you had entire communities battling deadly sickness, while smelling worse than usual. But in the long view of history, these struggles with hygiene shaped the future. Slowly, lessons were learned. Towns began to build better wells, regulate waste disposal, and eventually, centuries later, develop sewer systems. Even the idea that cleanliness was tied to godliness left a mark. Rituals of washing, blessing water, and purifying spaces would evolve into cultural habits of cleanliness we still see today. For the medieval villager, though, clean was always a flexible word. It might mean rinsing your hands in a bucket after feeding the pigs. It might mean sweeping mud out the door before guests arrived. It might mean confessing sins at church while your clothes still smelled of smoke and sweat. Their world taught them that purity wasn't just soap and water. It was survival, resilience, and faith that life could continue, no matter how messy things got. So, the next time you grumble about your shower running cold, just remember, a medieval villager would have thought you were living in paradise. Hot water on demand, soap in a bottle, a bathroom with an actual flush. To them, that would have sounded like pure magic. But it leaves us with one last thought. If their sense of hygiene was shaped by survival and necessity, not comfort, what can it tell us about our own world, where cleanliness is easy, yet we still find ourselves chasing that elusive feeling of being truly clean? Imagine walking down the main lane of a medieval village. No cobblestones, no neat drains, no cheerful flower pots hanging from windows. Instead, you're trudging through a mix of mud, animal droppings and, yes, human waste. Your shoes, if you had any, would never be the same again. The idea of clean streets simply didn't exist. Streets were for living, for walking, for animals, and for waste. The truth is, dealing with human filth in medieval villages was less about removing it and more about coping with it. Most cottages didn't have private toilets. Instead, people used chamber pots, basically little buckets, during the night. And in the morning, well, the contents were often tossed outside, sometimes into a pit, sometimes into the garden, and sometimes just out the door onto the street. If you think stepping in gum on the sidewalk is bad, imagine stepping in something much worse, first thing in the morning. Bigger towns had regulations. Officials tried to keep streets at least somewhat passable, with fines for people caught dumping waste directly outside. But in a small village, rules were looser. Waste mingled with rainwater, forming little streams that trickled downhill. On dry days, the mess hardened into crust. On wet days, it was more like soup. Either way, the smell travelled far and the flies were delighted. But before we judge too harshly, it's worth remembering that villagers did have systems, primitive ones, but systems nonetheless. Some dug simple pits outside their homes, covered them when full, and dug new ones. Others used manure heaps, mixing human waste with animal droppings to fertilise fields. Recycling, medieval style. Farmers knew the land needed enrichment, and if that meant spreading night soil, as it was politely called, on crops, so be it. The connection between waste and disease wasn't fully understood yet, so what smelled disgusting to us was, to them, useful. Then there were the public ditches. Many villages had open drainage ditches running alongside paths. Ideally, they carried away rainwater and waste. Realistically, they clogged with straw, rotten food, and other debris until they became more like open sewers. Children played near them anyway. Chickens pecked around them, dogs drank from them. For the villagers, this wasn't shocking, it was just part of the background of life. And yes, accidents happened. Historical records mention people slipping into cesspits or ditches, sometimes fatally. It wasn't just embarrassing, it could be deadly. Falling into a medieval waste pit was about as close as you could get to a nightmare. You wouldn't want to be remembered in the parish register as the one who drowned in muck. All of this meant that smell was constant. Travellers often complained about the stench of villages and towns long before they could see the rooftops. Imagine approaching a settlement and knowing you were close not by sight, but by your nose. That's how common and accepted waste was in the medieval street. Yet, people carried on. They fetched water, cooked food, and raised families in the same spaces where filth was ever present. To them, it wasn't shocking. It was normal. After all, if everyone lived with the same smells, maybe you just stopped noticing. If the streets of a medieval village were messy, you might be wondering, didn't they have toilets? The short answer is, sort of. The long answer is much less glamorous. Many households relied on the humble chamber pot, a bucket or bowl used indoors, especially at night. In the morning, someone, often a child, unlucky apprentice or the housewife, had to empty it. Where? Options varied. Into a pit if you had one, onto the manure pile if you farmed, or directly into the street if you were feeling lazy. Good morning, neighbours would have had a very different meaning if you stepped outside at the wrong time. Bigger houses or wealthier families sometimes built privies, simple wooden huts over a hole in the ground. Think of it as the medieval version of an outhouse. It wasn't fancy, but it gave you a little privacy and a place for the waste to go. Once the pit filled up, people covered it with earth and dug a new one. This method was better than tossing everything into the lane, but it still wasn't exactly hygienic by modern standards. Imagine the smell of a summer afternoon in a crowded village, with multiple privy pits baking in the sun. Villages also had communal solutions. Some dug larger cesspits for several families, while others used open ditches. In towns, regulations even specified how deep and wide cesspits should be. But no matter how carefully you dug, problems happened. Cesspits overflowed in heavy rain, seeping into wells or streams. Rats, flies, and other pests thrived around them, and every so often someone accidentally fell in, a truly undignified way to go down in history. Still, waste wasn't always seen as waste. farmers valued it as fertilizer. Human excrement, politely called night soil, was collected and spread on fields. The smell was dreadful, but it enriched the soil, helping crops grow. To peasants, it wasn't disgusting. It was practical recycling. Of course, they didn't know about bacteria or parasites, so while the fields grew green, so did the chances of disease spreading. And speaking of disease, it's no surprise that outbreaks like dysentery, typhoid, and cholera were common. Contaminated water was often the culprit. Villagers might haul water from a stream just downstream of where waste was dumped. No amount of rosemary or mint stuffed into one's nose could completely mask what that meant, and yet, without alternatives, they had no choice. Interestingly, some records show attempts at improvement. In certain villages, fines were given for dumping waste too close to wells. Town councils in medieval Europe passed laws about when and where waste could be thrown, but enforcement was patchy. After all, who wanted the job of waste inspector? Not exactly the most glamorous medieval career. So, life went on. Waste was dug, dumped, or spread, and villagers accepted it as part of their world. What shocks us now, the thought of a street filled with muck, was simply their normal Tuesday afternoon. By now, you can probably picture a medieval village street. Mud, animals, waste, and an atmosphere that made your nose want to file a complaint. But how did ordinary people cope with such conditions? After all, they still had to eat, drink, and raise children right in the middle of it. One key defence was smell management. People stuffed herbs, flowers, and spices into pockets, sleeves, or little cloth pouches called pomanders. Rosemary, sage, lavender. These weren't just nice smells. They were thought to protect against disease by warding off bad air or miasma. Walking through a filthy street with a sprig of mint pressed to your nose was the medieval equivalent of wearing a scented mask. It didn't stop germs, they didn't even know germs existed, but it gave at least the illusion of safety. Then there was adaptation through routine. Villagers learned where not to walk. Narrow alleys had waste zones, and locals knew which side of the street was safest after chamber pots were emptied in the morning. Children grew up with this knowledge instinctively, like an unspoken survival map. Outsiders, meanwhile, often found themselves stepping straight into trouble. Another trick? Timing. Fetching water early in the morning was best, before waste from chamber pots began pouring into the gutters. And if you had to walk through town, you learned to move quickly and avoid standing in one place too long. Imagine a game of survival that lasted your whole life. Dodge the muck, dodge the splash. Keep your boots clean enough to reuse tomorrow. Of course, people also leaned heavily on faith. When disease struck, they often blamed sin, demons, or God's punishment. Pilgrimages, prayers, and blessings were seen as a defence, just as important as any ditch or privy. In some places, holy water was sprinkled around homes to purify the air. It didn't make the waste disappear, but it gave a sense of control in a world that felt uncontrollable. And perhaps most importantly, villagers developed a kind of stubborn resilience. To us, their environment seems unbearable, but to them, it was simply life. The stench of manure and waste wasn't an intrusion. It was the background music of existence. They laughed, gossiped, and lived their daily lives right alongside it. If a medieval villager could time travel to our disinfected bathrooms, they might be more shocked by the smell of nothing than by the reek of their own streets. In the end, the villagers' survival strategies weren't perfect, but they worked well enough for communities to endure. Diseases came and went, streets filled and emptied, but life always continued. People adjusted, invented little routines, and carried on with stubborn cheerfulness. So next time you're annoyed about taking the trash out, or when your bathroom smells a little less than fresh, remember, at least you don't have to dodge chamber pots flying out of windows, or worse, step into a puddle you can't quite identify. If you've ever been annoyed by a single mosquito buzzing in your bedroom, imagine living in a world where your nightly companions weren't just mosquitoes, but an entire army of tiny invaders, lice, fleas, and bedbugs. In the medieval village, sleeping alone was nearly impossible, not because your bed was shared with family, but because it was already fully occupied by pests. Medieval mattresses, often stuffed with straw, hay, or feathers, were basically five-star resorts for insects. The straw offered hiding places, warmth, and just enough moisture to keep bugs thriving. Add in unwashed sheets, because laundry was rare and soap was expensive, and you had the perfect breeding ground. Once pests moved in, they didn't politely leave. Lice were the most infamous. They lived in hair, beards and clothing, laying eggs, nits, that clung stubbornly to fibres. People tried to pick them out by hand or crush them with fingernails, a process so common it even became a social activity. Picture two villagers sitting by the fire, chatting, and casually combing lice out of each other's hair. Not exactly glamorous, but normal. Fleas were worse in many ways. They didn't just bite, they spread disease. A flea bite itched like crazy, and when thousands of them lived in the rushes on the floor or in the straw of the bed, the irritation was constant. Worse still, fleas were the carriers of the plague, the tiny creatures that, in the mid-14th century, helped wipe out nearly half of Europe's population. For villagers, fleas weren't just annoying, they were potentially deadly. Bedbugs, meanwhile, specialised in nighttime misery. These flat, sneaky insects came out in the dark, crawling over sleepers to suck their blood. People often woke up with red, itchy marks across their arms and necks, but rarely knew what had caused them. The bedbug, after all, was a master of hiding in cracks and seams, perfectly adapted to a world without chemical sprays or hot washing machines. So, a medieval night of sleep wasn't the peaceful rest we like to imagine. It was more like an involuntary buffet, only you were the main course. The idea of tucking yourself in with warm blankets and drifting into dreams. For many it was more like tucking in and preparing to be nibbled from head to toe. And yet, this wasn't considered unusual. Just as we expect to brush our teeth before bed, they expected to share their rest with pests. It was part of daily life, so ordinary that medieval humour sometimes joked about lice as God's little companions. Dark humour perhaps, but when you can't get rid of the bugs you might as well laugh at them. Now, you might be wondering, didn't they at least try to fight back? Oh yes, they did, but the fight against lice, fleas and bedbugs was like trying to chase smoke with a broom. The bugs always seemed to win. The simplest weapon was the fingernail. People regularly sat down to crack lice between their thumbnails with a satisfying little pop. Mothers did it for children, wives for husbands, and friends for friends. It was almost a bonding ritual. Think of it as medieval Netflix and chill, except with nitpicking instead of popcorn. Combs were another common tool. Made of bone, wood or metal, fine-toothed combs were used to drag lice and their eggs out of hair. Archaeologists often find these ancient lice combs still clogged with the remains of their victims. Tiny reminders that someone long ago spent their evening scratching and scraping their scalp. When it came to fleas, people tried sprinkling herbs and powders into beds. Lavender, pennyroyal and wormwood were believed to repel insects with their strong scents. In theory, this helped. In reality, the fleas probably just laughed and hopped back on the mattress. Bedbugs were even trickier, since they hid deep in the cracks of wooden bed frames or in the seams of blankets. People sometimes tried scalding their beds with boiling water, or even briefly setting fire to straw mattresses, hoping to smoke the bugs out before the house itself caught fire. Risky business. And then there was the clothing method. Because lice laid their eggs in fabric, people would sometimes boil or bake their garments to kill the insects. Unfortunately, not every household could afford to do this often. Some poor villagers had only 1 or 2 sets of clothing, and washing was a rare luxury. That meant lice had a permanent home, marching up and down shirts and trousers like little landlords. Still, humour helped. Lice were often called companions of poverty, and people joked that a man could never be truly alone as long as he had lice to keep him company. Priests even preached sermons comparing sinners to fleas, clinging stubbornly to the world. It was a strange comfort. If everyone had them, at least you weren't suffering alone. But in the end, no matter how much combing, crushing or boiling was done, the bugs always came back. Beds were never completely free, and villagers accepted this with a mix of frustration and resignation. A medieval saying summed it up: God made man, man made lice. By now, you might think villagers spent half their lives scratching, and you wouldn't be far off. But here's the twist. Pests weren't just an annoyance. They shaped social life, habits, and even people's reputations. For one thing, being visibly lousy, literally crawling with lice, was a sign of poverty and neglect. A nobleman might pay servants to nitpick him clean, while a poor farmhand had no such luxury. This meant pests became a marker of class. Clean hair and clothes were rare enough that if someone looked relatively bug-free, it was a small badge of status. At the same time, nobody was truly immune. Kings, bishops, and knights all battle the same creepy crawlies. Imagine a castle banquet, golden goblets, roasted venison, a lute playing softly in the background, and half the guests discreetly scratching under the table. Pests were the great equaliser, reminding everyone, rich or poor, that their skin was tasty. Humour often helped dull the discomfort. Medieval jokes compared bedbugs to unwanted bedfellows who refused to leave in the morning. Street plays sometimes mocked travellers covered in fleas, dancing around as though choreographed by tiny biting masters. And even in serious writings, pests slipped in. Chroniclers described how lice swarmed soldiers during long campaigns, weakening entire armies not just with wounds, but with sleepless nights of constant itching. Then there was the health factor. Fleas carried more than irritation. They carried plague. Most famously, the Black Death of the 14th century spread in part through flea bites on rats, devastating villages that already thought of pests as annoying but harmless. Suddenly, these little creatures weren't just a nuisance in bed. They were invisible executioners. Yet, despite everything, villagers adapted. They scratched in public without shame. They picked lice as a casual favour. They joked about bedbugs as though they were extra members of the household. To them, it was simply life. A bit itchy, a bit gross, but familiar. So when a medieval villager finally lay down at night, on straw, hay, or a feather bed, they didn't expect peace. They expected to share their rest with a whole buzzing, crawling, biting community. Sleep was never truly solitary, and maybe, in a strange way, that made medieval people feel a little less alone. If you've ever had a nightmare about going to the dentist, be thankful you weren't living in a medieval village. Forget shiny dental chairs, numbing injections, and that polite dentist who asks you questions while your mouth is wide open. In the Middle Ages, dental care was, let's just say, a very loose concept. For starters, people rarely brushed their teeth in the way we do today. Toothbrushes with bristles weren't common in Europe until much later, and toothpaste was still centuries away. Instead, folks turned to what they called tooth powders, a mix of crushed herbs, ashes, salt, and sometimes even ground up animal bones or oyster shells. Imagine scrubbing your teeth with salty ashes or chalk dust and you'll get the idea. Effective? Sort of. Comfortable? Definitely not. And even when they tried to clean their teeth, the results weren't always pleasant. Recipes for medieval dental powders survive in old manuscripts, and they're creative. Some called for burnt rosemary mixed with honey. Others suggested rubbing your teeth with cloth dipped in vinegar. If that didn't freshen your breath, maybe nothing would. But here's the bigger problem: diet. Medieval people ate lots of bread, porridge, and meat, but sugar started creeping in through trade. Richer folks especially loved sugary sweets, candied fruits, and spiced wines. The result? Cavities and rotting teeth. A wealthy knight might have more holes in his mouth than a poor shepherd simply because he could afford more sugar. Ironically, wealth often meant worse teeth. So what happened when pain struck? Toothache remedies were plentiful, though not always helpful. A village healer might recommend rinsing your mouth with wine, stuffing herbs into the aching cavity, or wearing charms against toothworms. Yes, they actually believed tiny worms inside the tooth caused pain. The treatments were often worse than the illness, and if all else failed, there was the final terrifying option: extraction. No anaesthetic, no numbing gel, no soothing background music. Just a sturdy pair of iron pliers, a strong hand, and maybe a prayer. Tooth pulling was sometimes done by barbers, the same people who cut hair and perform small surgeries. So yes, you could go in for a haircut and come out missing a molar. Now, when it came to serious dental problems, medieval people didn't exactly book an appointment at a neat little clinic. Instead, they went to whoever had the courage and the tools to deal with it. And that person was often the barber. Yes, the same man who trimmed your beard, cut your hair, and maybe even bled you with leeches would also yank out your aching tooth. Barbers were like the Swiss Army knives of medieval healthcare. Scissors in one hand, a razor in the other, and somewhere nearby a pair of iron forceps for tooth extraction. Not exactly comforting. But barbers weren't the only ones in the business. Markets often had tooth pullers, men, and sometimes women, who set up a little stall, waved around shiny iron tools, and promised to rid you of your toothache in exchange for a few coins. They were part medical worker, part street performer. In fact, tooth pulling could be a public spectacle. The tooth puller might shout out to gather a crowd, boast about his skill, and then, before everyone's eyes, yank out the offending tooth with a dramatic flourish. And the crowd would cheer. Imagine your worst dental moment turning into Saturday night entertainment. Of course, pain relief was minimal. At best, you might be given a strong swig of ale or wine before the big pull. Some healers suggested chewing on cloves, which actually have mild numbing properties, so that wasn't a bad idea. Others used herbal concoctions or charms to distract the pain. But make no mistake, extraction was an ordeal. Sometimes, though, they tried to save the tooth instead of pulling it. Treatments included scraping away decay with metal instruments, filling holes with paste made of wax and herbs, or cauterizing the tooth with a hot iron. Yes, you heard right. If you thought a root canal was bad, imagine someone pressing red-hot metal against your gums in the name of healing. And if your teeth fell out? Well, false teeth existed, but they weren't for the average villager. Wealthy nobles sometimes wore dentures made from carved bone, ivory, or even human teeth taken from corpses, which is just as creepy as it sounds. They didn't work well, but at least they looked like teeth when you weren't trying to chew. So, what did all this mean for the average medieval villager? In short, nobody had a Hollywood smile. Teeth were crooked, yellowed, and often missing altogether. Rotten breath was simply part of daily life. People got used to it, the way we might get used to traffic noise or Wi-Fi dropping out. If everyone smells the same, no one notices, at least not enough to complain. But appearances still mattered. Among the wealthy, especially nobles and merchants, teeth were a symbol of health and status. While peasants worried about back-breaking farm work, lords and ladies had the luxury of fussing over their smiles, sometimes even rubbing their gums with honey, herbs, or oils to keep them fresh. Of course, honey probably did more harm than good, but at least it felt fancy. Religious beliefs also played a role. Bad teeth were sometimes seen as a sign of sin, punishment, or even demonic influence. After all, if your breath could make someone faint, perhaps it wasn't just garlic. It was the devil himself creeping in through your molars. Priests often advised prayers or pilgrimages for tooth pain, and relics of saints were said to cure it. One popular saint, Apollonia, became the patron saint of dentistry after being tortured by having her teeth pulled out. People prayed to her when the pain became unbearable. On the other hand, laughter and smiling were viewed differently than today. Most medieval. Portraits and writings suggest people weren't too focused on showing off their teeth anyway. A subtle smile with lips closed was the norm, which is convenient when your mouth is full of gaps and smells like fermented onions. Despite all the discomfort, there's something strangely human about it. Medieval dental care shows us that people have always wrestled with pain, tried home remedies, and feared the dentist's tools. The difference is, while we have numbing injections and toothbrushes, they had wine and a very enthusiastic barber. So next time you grumble about flossing or dread your annual checkup, just remember, at least you don't have to sit in the middle of a crowded marketplace while someone yanks your tooth out with rusty pliers, followed by applause. When you picture a medieval castle or even a small village cottage, you might imagine roaring fires, heavy wooden beams, maybe a pig wandering through the kitchen. What you probably don't imagine is, well, where people went when nature called. Yet, like us, medieval folks couldn't escape the inevitable. And without modern plumbing, the solutions were both creative and, let's be honest, slightly disgusting. The grand invention of the time was the privy. These were little outhouse-like structures built either in a yard or attached to the side of a larger building. Imagine a tiny wooden shed with a hole in the middle of a wooden bench. Beneath that hole, a pit. That's it. No flushing, no scented candles, no glossy magazines. Just a hole and the hope that you wouldn't fall in. Privies were often shared by whole households, or, in the case of castles, by dozens of servants and guards. The smell? Let's just say air freshener hadn't been invented yet. For those who didn't have the luxury of an outdoor privy, there was the chamber pot. This was exactly what it sounds like. A pot, usually made of clay or metal, tucked under the bed or in a corner. When the urge struck in the middle of the night, instead of braving the freezing cold or the wolves outside, you simply pulled out the pot, did your business, and went back to sleep. Romantic, isn't it? But here's the catch. Chamber pots had to be emptied. Often, servants carried them out in the morning, sloshing their way through corridors to dump the contents into the street or a cesspit. If you were your own servant, well, congratulations, you got to deal with your own pot. and if you didn't clean it properly, your whole house began to smell like, well, like medieval life. Castles sometimes had a slightly fancier version called a garderobe. These were little rooms built into the castle wall, with a hole that dropped waste directly into the moat or a pit below. The problem? Castles were often under siege. Let's just say moats weren't only filled with water. Okay, so we've established that medieval people did their business in holes, pots, and castle wall cutouts. But the question remains, what happened next? Because let's face it, you can only use a pit or pot for so long before, well, it fills up. In villages, waste often ended up in cesspits, basically large holes in the ground where human filth collected until someone decided to shovel it out. Yes, that was a real job. In cities, things were even messier. Many households simply tossed the contents of their chamber pots out of windows and into the street. Imagine walking home after a long day at the market, minding your own business, when suddenly, splash. If you thought modern cities have traffic problems, at least they don't have airborne toilets. To warn passers-by, some people shouted phrases like "Gardez-le," a corruption of the French "Gardez-l'eau," meaning watch out for the water. But, let's be honest, when something brown and smelly is falling from the sky, no amount of warning makes it better. In castles, garderobes often drained directly into moats. This made moats less sparkling water features and more giant medieval septic tanks. And because castles were attacked regularly, enemies weren't just dealing with arrows and boiling oil, they also had to wade through a stew of, well, you get the idea. Not exactly the glorious battlefield anyone dreamed of. The waste problem wasn't just gross, it was dangerous. Medieval cities, especially crowded ones like London, had narrow streets, poor drainage, and far too many people dumping their waste in the same place. The result? Filthy streets, polluted rivers, and a breeding ground for disease. It's no surprise that outbreaks like cholera and plague spread so quickly. When your drinking water came from the same river that everyone else used as a sewer, you were practically inviting germs to dinner, and let's not forget the smell. Imagine hot summer days with waste baking in the sun, mixing with animal dung and rotting food. Travellers often wrote about medieval towns reeking long before you even reached the gates. In other words, if you lived in the Middle Ages, your nose never got a day off. So while we today flush and forget, medieval people lived with waste as a daily, visible, and very smelly part of life. And sadly, unlike chamber pots, you couldn't just shove the whole problem under the bed and pretend it wasn't there. Today most of us take bathroom privacy for granted. We shut the door, lock it, and thank our lucky stars that nobody is around to witness, well, anything. But in the medieval world, privacy wasn't always part of the deal. For one thing, guardrobes and privies were often shared. In monasteries, long rows of stone or wooden seats were built side by side so monks could sit together while doing their business. Imagine trying to quietly reflect on your sins while Brother Thomas next to you is making sounds that are less than holy. If you've ever dreaded using a public restroom, medieval monks had it far worse. In castles, nobles sometimes had their own guardrobes, but own didn't always mean private. Servants had to clean, empty, and even stand guard nearby. And let's not forget, those castle guardrobes were drafty little closets high above the moat. Not exactly the spa-like bathroom retreat we enjoy today. Chamber pots, too, were rarely personal. Families often shared them, especially in small cottages. And at night, when it was too dark or dangerous to go outside, people would pass the chamber pot around like it was just another household item. Imagine a midnight handoff. Here, it's your turn. Not exactly the bedtime routine you'd want to remember. Even etiquette was different. In some settings, using the toilet wasn't a shameful secret. It was just part of life. The very word privy comes from a private, but in practice, privacy was relative. For travellers on long journeys, relieving oneself by the roadside was normal, and in busy cities finding a discreet spot was a constant challenge. Let's just say medieval folk weren't easily embarrassed. Despite all the awkwardness, waste management slowly improved. By the late Middle Ages, some cities experimented with regulations to keep streets cleaner, and wealthier households installed more advanced guardrobes with drains. But still, the average person's toilet experience remained a mix of inconvenience, discomfort, and company they didn't necessarily want. So, while our modern bathrooms may sometimes feel too small, too noisy, or too busy, remember this. At least you don't have to share a wooden bench with 3 strangers, listen to the echoes of a stone privy, or dodge flying chamber pots on your evening walk. Compared to medieval life, even the tiniest restroom is a luxury palace. If you lived in a medieval village, washing was optional, but if you were a monk in a monastery, well, washing was practically a commandment. Monastic life came with strict rules, and many of them involved keeping clean, at least by the standards of the time. The famous Benedictine rule, written in the 6th century, had plenty to say about daily habits. Benedict didn't want monks to become lazy or too luxurious, but he also understood that smelly, unwashed monks don't make the best impression of holy living, so he made space in the monastic schedule for regular washing, especially before meals and prayers. You couldn't chant psalms with dirty hands. Monasteries usually had a lavatorium, a designated washing area, often a long stone trough with running water where monks would line up to wash hands and faces. No soap bars or perfumed shampoos here, just cold water straight from a spring or aqueduct, splashing on shaved heads and scrubbed hands. It was simple, but compared to the average medieval peasant, monks were practically spagoers. Bathing, however, was another story. Some monasteries allowed it a few times a year, others frowned upon it as a sign of vanity. The reasoning went something like this: if you spend too much time scrubbing your body, you might neglect your soul. But still, most rules allowed monks to bathe occasionally, especially if they were sick, travelling, or preparing for important religious feasts. In other words, cleanliness was next to godliness, but only in moderation. Monks also had rules about their clothes. Linen undergarments, for instance, had to be washed regularly. Imagine the laundry room of a large monastery, a line of brothers scrubbing away at long tunics, dunking them into vats of water, and hanging them up to dry in the cloister courtyard. Compared to villagers who sometimes wore the same shirt until it disintegrated, monks were practically fashion models. And it wasn't just about hygiene, it was a ritual. Washing before meals and prayers symbolised purity, a way to cleanse not just dirt but also spiritual distractions. For monks, rinsing their hands in cold water wasn't just practical, it was an act of devotion, a reminder to keep their souls as spotless as their fingers. Now, here's the funny thing. Despite all the rules about washing, monasteries were still in the Middle Ages, which means lice, fleas, and general stink were pretty much unavoidable. You can only do so much with cold water and a stone trough. Monks shaved their heads in a style called the tonsure, that bald circle in the middle with hair around the sides. It was a symbol of humility, but it also had a side effect: fewer places for lice to hide. Smart move. Unfortunately, their woolen robes were still like 5-star hotels for bugs. So yes, even the holiest monk could be sitting in the chapel, quietly scratching while chanting psalms. The rules tried to help. Many monasteries required monks to change their undergarments once or twice a week, which, believe it or not, was extremely hygienic compared to villagers. But when laundry didn't get done on time, the problem piled up fast. Imagine a group of monks all wearing week-old linens in a closed-off chapel, with incense smoke drifting around. That holy aroma wasn't entirely from the frankincense. Punishments for filth could even be spiritual. If a monk let himself become too dirty, too sloppy, or smelly enough to disturb others, it was seen as a sign of neglect, not just of the body, but of discipline and humility. A brother might be corrected, scolded, or assigned extra chores like laundry duty, which sounds more like community service than divine punishment, but still effective. Interestingly, some monasteries had communal baths, though don't picture anything glamorous. We're talking about large wooden tubs filled with lukewarm water, and maybe a bit of herbal infusion if the monastery had an apothecary. A few monks at a time would take turns, probably praying the whole while that Brother Matthew didn't use too much soapwork last round. Still, filth had to be managed. Too much dirt and disease could spread, and monasteries often doubled as hospitals for the poor. A filthy monk wouldn't exactly inspire trust as a caregiver. That's why monasteries enforced washing rituals, especially for monks working in the kitchen, infirmary, or scriptoria, where manuscripts were copied. Ink stains were one thing. Food poisoning from dirty hands was another. For monks, washing wasn't just about staying bug-free, it was about staying spiritually pure. Dirt was often seen as a symbol of sin, and clean water represented cleansing the soul. So, when monks washed their hands before meals, or rinsed their faces before prayer, it wasn't only hygiene, it was a mini ritual of holiness. Some monasteries even had running water systems, aqueducts, pipes and stone basins, centuries before ordinary villagers could dream of such luxuries. Imagine living in a nearby hut, hauling muddy buckets from a river, and then walking past the abbey where the monks had a neat little fountain for washing hands. You'd probably think, wow, these guys must really be God's favourites. Soap was another curiosity. While peasants often went without, monks had access to simple soaps made from lye and animal fat. Not exactly lavender-scented spa bars, but enough to scrub away grime. Some used herbs like sage, rosemary or thyme for a little fragrance, though the smell probably didn't last long once you put the wool robe back on. Bathing, too, was occasionally spiritual. Special feast days or important holy festivals sometimes required monks to take a bath in preparation. Not because anyone thought God cared if you smelled of sheep, but because physical cleansing was a metaphor for inner purity. Clean body, clean soul. And while the average medieval villager might only wash when rain caught them by surprise, monasteries stood as rare islands of cleanliness. Travellers, pilgrims, and even local peasants sometimes noticed the difference. Over time, monastic rules about washing influenced wider society. Little by little, ideas about hygiene trickled outward, though it would still take centuries before daily showers became a thing. Still, we can say this much. Monks weren't modern hygiene heroes, but in a world of mud, manure, and mystery smells, they at least tried. Their soap was rough, their baths infrequent, their robes scratchy, but compared to a medieval village, they were practically the clean freaks of their age. So, next time you light a scented candle, wash your hands with foamy soap or step into a hot shower. Spare a thought for the medieval monk who once stood in a draughty cloister, splashing cold water on his face, hoping it washed away not just the dirt, but the sins of the world. If you've ever stepped into a crowded summer bus and thought, wow, it stinks in here, well, imagine living your entire life like that. Medieval towns and villages didn't just smell bad, they were olfactory battlegrounds. With chamber pots dumped into streets, animals wandering freely, and people bathing once in a blue moon, the air was a cocktail of, let's just say, natural aromas. So how did medieval people cope? They didn't have modern deodorants, air fresheners, or scented candles from them all. Instead, they turned to herbs and perfumes to mask the smell. Not to eliminate it, of course. Nothing could really fight off the stench of 200 unwashed bodies in a marketplace, but at least to make life more tolerable. Women, especially those of higher status, often carried little pouches called pomanders. These were tiny containers filled with cloves, cinnamon, dried lavender, or even ambergris. Yes, that waxy stuff from whale intestines, very fashionable, very gross. They would hang the pomander from their belts or necklaces, creating a small bubble of nice smell around them, like the medieval version of walking around with a pocket-sized air diffuser. Herbs were also stuffed into homes, especially in rushes that were scattered on the floors. Imagine sitting in a smoky cottage, the walls dark with soot, and under your feet, dried lavender and mint trying their hardest to fight the smell of goat dung wafting in from outside. It didn't always work, but hey, at least it was effort. And let's not forget perfumes. By the late Middle Ages, perfumed oils and waters, often imported from the Middle East, were a luxury item for the wealthy. Rosewater, orange blossom, and musk were all popular. A noble woman might dab a little on her wrists or clothing, not so much to smell nice in the way we think of today, but to smell less bad. Of course, the irony is that perfumes mixed with sweat didn't always make things better. A peasant might smell like mud and cabbage, but a noble could end up reeking like a sweaty rose garden. Still, between the two, most people would pick sweaty rose garden. If you walked into a medieval cottage, chances are the first thing you'd notice wasn't the cosy fireplace or the wooden beams. It was the smell. Smoke from the hearth, damp straw beds, animals sharing the living space, and humans who hadn't bathed since Easter. Not exactly the fresh scent of pine and lemon polish. To fight back, people leaned heavily on herbs. Floors were often strewn with rushes, long grasses, mixed with aromatic plants like lavender, sage, and thyme. Every so often the rushes were replaced, though not always as often as you'd hope. A visitor might see a greenish, crunchy floor covering and think, ah, fresh herbs, when in reality it was months old, flattened, smelly straw with a sprig of rosemary tossed on top for good measure. Herbs also had a reputation for being protective. During outbreaks of the plague, people would carry nosegays, little bunches of flowers or herbs, to sniff when walking through town. The belief was that disease spread through bad air, the miasma theory. So if you could cover that air with a nicer smell, you were safe. Doctors with those creepy bird-like plague masks even stuffed the beaks with herbs like cloves and juniper berries. Frightening fashion, but at least it smelled better than the street. Even in sick rooms, herbs were part of daily life. Patients might be surrounded by burning incense or sprinkled with rosewater, not necessarily because it cured anything, but because it made their last moments slightly less unbearable. Monasteries and hospitals often burned juniper or frankincense to purify the air. Imagine lying in bed with a fever while your nurse tosses sage into the fire saying, "There, that'll keep the death smell away." Comforting, sort of. And outside the home? Herbs were sometimes scattered in public places, especially on holy days. Churches, for example, might cover their floors with sweet-smelling plants during festivals, so the whole building carried an air of celebration, and also to mask the scent of hundreds of sweaty worshippers packed together. If herbs were the everyday soldier in the war against stink, perfumes were the knights, expensive, flashy, and a little impractical. Real perfumes in the medieval world weren't something a peasant could afford. They were imported luxuries, often arriving from the Middle East or Italy, distilled from roses, jasmine, musk, or ambergris. Yes, that odd waxy substance from whale intestines. To dab some on your sleeve was like saying, "Behold! I'm rich enough to smell like roses instead of goats." Perfumes weren't just about covering bad smells. They were about status. The wealthy might perfume their gloves, their hair, or even the pages of a book. Ladies carried pomanders, little metal balls filled with aromatic substances, hanging from chains at their waists. They could lift them to their noses whenever they passed through a particularly offensive-smelling street, which was basically every street. Think of it as the medieval version of walking around with a designer perfume bottle dangling from your belt. But here's the fun part. Smelling too good could actually raise suspicion. Medieval moralists sometimes grumbled that perfumes encouraged vanity and sin. If a woman walked by smelling of musk and roses, some monks might mutter, "She's trying to tempt men." In contrast, holy saints were said to give off a heavenly fragrance even in death. So apparently there was a fine line between smelling blessed and smelling scandalous. For the common folk, the closest thing to perfume was maybe rinsing their hands in rosewater at a feast or sprinkling lavender on their clothes during laundry. Perfumes were rare treasures. If a peasant got a whiff of frankincense at Christmas Mass, that was probably their once-a-year experience of exotic scent. The rest of the year, back to herbs, smoke and sweat. By the late Middle Ages, though, perfumes became a bit more widespread. Trade routes expanded, recipes were written down, and apothecaries sold scented waters in towns. Still, to smell nice was never just about comfort. It was about sending a message. In a world where everyone reeked of animals, latrines and fire smoke, having a whiff of roses trailing behind you was like declaring, "I am someone important." So whether it was rosemary on the floor, a pomander at your belt, or a dab of imported rose oil, medieval life was a constant battle against the nose. And while they never really won that battle, they certainly got creative trying. When the Black Death rolled into Europe in the mid-14th century, people suddenly started to look at hygiene very differently. Before the plague, most folks accepted dirt, fleas and bad smells as just part of life. But once entire villages were wiped out in a matter of weeks, the stink of filth began to feel like more than just unpleasant. It felt dangerous, almost like death itself had an odour. Doctors at the time didn't know about germs or bacteria. Instead, they believed in the theory of miasma, which basically meant that disease floated through the air as invisible poisonous vapours. Bad smells, they thought, carried illness. So if your neighbour's house reeked, you might assume the air itself could infect you. Suddenly, keeping clean wasn't just about comfort. It was about survival. The arrival of plague sparked waves of purification rituals. Towns burned barrels of herbs in the streets, hoping sweet smoke would drive away the deadly air. Vinegar was splashed on doorways and clothing. Some people carried posies of flowers under their noses, thinking a constant sniff of lavender or rosemary could ward off disease. The nursery rhyme, "Ring-a-ring-a-roses." Many say it grew from this habit. Bathing, however, was a tricky subject. Public bathhouses had been common in Europe for centuries, but during plague years many were closed. Why? Because authorities feared that hot water opened the pores, letting in the poisonous air. So while some clung to baths as a way to wash off danger, others avoided them like the plague, quite literally. And then, there were the extremes. Some people avoided washing altogether, believing that dirt formed a protective barrier against the bad air. Others scrubbed obsessively with vinegar, garlic water, or even urine, yes really, in hopes of keeping the sickness at bay. Desperation made strange habits normal. By the time the plague had swept through once, hygiene had become tied to fear, superstition, and the desperate search for safety. For medieval people, filth wasn't just uncomfortable anymore. It was potentially lethal. When plague stalked the land, even the laziest of medieval towns suddenly discovered the concept of public health. Normally, waste and trash just piled up in the streets. Pigs rooting around in garbage was a perfectly normal sight. But with the arrival of plague, townsfolk panicked. Authorities ordered the sweeping of streets, the dumping of trash outside the walls, and even the slaughter of roaming dogs and cats, which ironically made things worse by letting rat populations grow unchecked. Monks and priests had their own take on purification. Monasteries, with their rules of hand-washing before prayer and communal meals, were already cleaner than most villages. But during outbreaks, monks added layers of ritual. Incense was burned during processions, not just for holiness, but also because people believed the fragrant smoke could cleanse the air. Some monasteries even sprinkled holy water mixed with herbs across their halls, as if disinfecting with a prayer. In cities, barrels of burning pitch or tar were set up in the market squares, filling the air with thick black smoke. Imagine walking through a town already suffocating from death and panic, only to have the air clogged with clouds of stinking smoke that was supposed to be protective. It might have made the plague worse for asthmatics, but it gave people a sense that they were fighting back. Meanwhile, wealthy nobles developed their own bizarre strategies. Some kings sealed themselves inside palaces, surrounded by perfumed cloths and bowls of vinegar water. Courtiers carried golden pomanders filled with cloves and cinnamon to sniff as they walked. Others commissioned plague doctors, those famous figures in beaked masks stuffed with herbs, to advise them. Ironically, the masks may have helped a little by filtering out flea-carrying dust, though nobody understood why. But the ordinary villager? They had to make do with what they had. Some smeared themselves with onions, garlic, or even butter. Others rubbed crushed emeralds on their skin, if they could get their hands on such things. The bravest, or perhaps the most desperate, drank potions made from ground toads or swallowed mercury, thinking poison could fight poison. Spoiler, it didn't. The plague didn't just kill millions, it forced medieval society to rethink how people lived together. Before the Black Death, cleanliness was more of a personal choice or luxury. Afterward, it became a matter of survival. Towns realised that filth in the streets wasn't just unpleasant, it was deadly. Suddenly, local councils began passing new laws. Waste had to be dumped farther outside town, butchers couldn't just leave animal guts lying in alleys, and tanners were pushed to the outskirts because of their stink. It wasn't modern sanitation, but it was a start. The fear of bad air, miasma, lingered for centuries. Cities planted more herb gardens, nobles built fountains, and some monasteries became models of cleanliness, with carefully managed water systems. In Venice, one of the hardest-hit cities, authorities invented quarantine. Ships had to wait 40 days before docking. This simple rule saved countless lives and slowly spread across Europe. Even in homes, habits shifted. Washing with vinegar or rosewater became common, not just for plague, but as a daily ritual. Families started hanging herbs above doors and windows year-round, convinced they kept away sickness. Some superstitions survived, of course, like carrying charms against evil spirits, but the emphasis on washing, fumigating, and separating the sick marked a new awareness of hygiene. Strangely enough, plague even influenced architecture. Narrow alleys were sometimes widened, cesspits were moved farther from wells, hospitals expanded, not just as places to pray, but as centres for care. Monks kept recording remedies, mixing herbs with prayers, unknowingly laying tiny foundations for future medicine. And perhaps the biggest change of all, people learned that survival depended not just on individual habits, but on community action. A single dirty street, a single sick neighbour, could doom an entire village. Hygiene became everyone's business, whether through sweeping the market square, boiling laundry, or burning incense together in church. So, while the plague was a horror beyond words, it also pushed medieval Europe to think cleaner, build smarter, and, though very slowly, step toward the modern idea of public health. If you wandered through a medieval village, you wouldn't just encounter humans. Oh no, animals were everywhere, chickens scratching in the dirt, pigs rooting around for scraps, cows mooing in the fields, dogs barking, cats prowling for mice, and the occasional goose causing chaos in the streets. Life was a constant ballet of four-legged chaos, and unsurprisingly it smelled like it. Animals weren't confined to pens or barns in most villages. Pigs often roamed freely, scavenging through garbage or leftover food from homes. Chickens pecked in the dirt near doorways, leaving their little droppings everywhere. And cows? Well, they were usually tethered to a post during the day, but they still contributed to the ever-present aroma of manure. Villagers stepped carefully on uneven dirt paths to avoid squelching piles of waste with their boots. Yet despite the smell, animals were essential. Pigs were food, cows provided milk, chickens gave eggs, and dogs often guarded property or helped herd livestock. Even cats had an important job, controlling vermin in granaries and homes. Humans and animals lived in close quarters not out of laziness, but necessity. A village without animals was a village without sustenance, and survival came first. Smell came second. Of course, this closeness brought challenges. Fleas and lice jumped easily from animals to humans. Mud, urine, and droppings coated streets, floors, and even bedding. Many villagers considered this just part of life, something to step over, sweep, or, if they were lucky, avoid. Some wealthier homes managed small fenced yards, but in most places humans and animals shared the same limited space. The smells weren't just unpleasant, they were functional. For example, manure was collected as fertilizer for crops. Pigs cleaned up scraps that humans didn't want. The odour served as a constant reminder of the cycle of life and survival in the village. Villagers accepted the stench because it was tied directly to their livelihood and food supply. Interestingly, some animals even influenced social life. Dogs and cats followed people to market or church. Chickens ran underfoot during festivals, and geese might warn the village of intruders, though often causing a ruckus in the process. In essence, animals were companions, workers, and warning systems rolled into one, all wrapped in a cloud of earthy, unmistakable scent. So while the medieval village smelled like manure, mud, and wet animals, it was also a bustling, functional ecosystem. Smell, dirt, and life were inseparable, and for villagers this messy coexistence was just another normal day. Living side by side with animals in medieval villages came with more than just smells. It also meant sharing their pests. Fleas, lice, and ticks thrived on the close quarters between humans and livestock. Pigs rooting through dirt, chickens scratching at the floor, and cats prowling near sleeping areas all brought tiny hitchhikers into homes and beds. A villager might wake up scratching furiously, only to discover they were hosting a whole medieval pet flea circus. Diseases also travelled this close human-animal network. While medieval people didn't understand germs, they noticed patterns. Villages with filthy streets, crowded animal pens, and unwashed people often suffered more from illness. Typhoid, dysentery, and plague could spread more easily when humans and animals mingled freely. And yet, even in the face of sickness, the practicalities of survival prevailed. Animals weren't banished. They were vital to food, trade, and work. Villagers developed coping strategies, often mixing superstition with practical hygiene. Smoke from hearth fires was thought to purify the air, and some homes burned herbs like sage or rosemary to repel fleas. Cats were especially valued in granaries, not just for catching mice, but for keeping the rat population, and thus fleas, in check. Dogs might patrol the village, guarding livestock and keeping vermin at bay, though they themselves often carried ticks and lice. Cleaning was a daily chore. Streets and yards were swept, animal droppings collected for manure, and bedding shaken out. Bathing remained rare, but at least hands were washed before meals, sometimes with water scented with herbs to mask the lingering animal odours. It was a constant balancing act. Too little care and disease spread. Too much, and you wasted precious time better spent feeding animals or working the land. Even festivals weren't exempt. During communal gatherings, animals might wander among people, livestock penning areas sometimes spilling into public spaces. The smell, the mud, and the noise were accepted as part of the sensory tapestry of village life. People joked, swatted flies, and endured it all, because animals were not optional. They were woven into every aspect of survival. So while fleas, filth, and disease made medieval village life challenging, villagers adapted. They learned which herbs kept pests away, how to manage manure, and how to live closely with creatures that were both essential and infuriating. Coexistence was messy, smelly, and sometimes dangerous, but it was life, and villagers had little choice but to embrace it. Living with animals wasn't just about survival. It shaped culture, habits, and even humour in medieval villages. Villagers quickly learned that animals could be both a blessing and a comedic nuisance. Pigs rooting through freshly swept streets, chickens stealing scraps from your breakfast, or a goat nibbling on a scarecrow made for endless small annoyances and endless jokes. Stories of mischievous animals appeared in local tales, sermons, and even marginal drawings in manuscripts reminding everyone that life was messy, smelly, and sometimes hilarious. Hygiene practices too were influenced by animals. People became meticulous about sweeping yards, moving manure and hanging herbs to repel pests. Bathing remained, infrequent, but hand-washing before meals and after handling animals became more common, not just for comfort but for survival. Villagers learned that cleanliness could prevent disease, even if their understanding of germs was non-existent. Simple acts, like keeping cats in granaries, dogs around livestock, or sprinkling herbs on floors, were practical solutions wrapped in centuries-old wisdom. Animals also shaped social life. They were central to festivals, markets, and work routines. Communal efforts like shared pastures or coordinated livestock care strengthened village bonds. Children grew up learning to care for animals, balancing affection with caution. Even the smell of manure or the sight of pigs in the streets became part of the village identity, something everyone accepted as a fact of life. Humour was the glue. Villagers laughed at the absurdities of life with animals. If a goose chased a priest or a cow wandered into the churchyard, it became a story retold at meals. This humour made the inevitable dirt and smell more bearable. Survival, after all, wasn't just about avoiding disease. It was about maintaining morale in a world full of mud, manure, and unpredictable livestock. In the end, medieval villagers didn't live separate from nature. They coexisted with it in a messy, smelly, yet practical way. Animals were food, helpers, pests, and companions all at once. Hygiene was adapted around their presence, rituals developed to manage their impact, and humour kept spirits high. So, while we might grimace at the idea of chickens in our kitchen or pigs roaming freely through town, medieval villagers would simply shrug, sweep the yard, and tell a funny story. Because animals weren't optional. They were life, smell, chaos, and joy all rolled into one. In a medieval village, hygiene wasn't just personal, it was seasonal. Summer and winter brought very different challenges, and villagers adapted their habits to match the changing weather, whether they liked it or not. Summer was hot, sticky, and full of sweat. People worked long hours in the fields, wore woolen clothes that didn't breathe well, and rarely bathed. The heat made every village smell of a mix of sweat, animals, and cooking fires. Yet, summer also offered a small advantage. Streams, rivers, and ponds were open and accessible. If someone had the energy and privacy, a quick dip could wash away the grime. Children and pigs often played together in the water, adding both joy and an extra layer of muddiness. Winter, on the other hand, brought cold, mud, and filth that couldn't simply be washed away. Streets turned into a mixture of frozen mud, animal waste, and decaying food scraps. Bathing in icy rivers was unthinkable, and fires in cottages kept people warm but smoky. Clothing was layered and rarely washed, trapping weeks or months of dirt, sweat, and odour close to the skin. Even the wealthiest villagers struggled to stay clean. Hygiene practices shifted with the seasons. In summer, villagers might wash hands before meals, rinse faces in streams, or use herbs to mask odours. In winter, routines were more about survival than cleanliness. Sweeping floors when possible, fumigating rooms with smoke, and layering clothing to stay warm took precedence. The smell of a winter village was a mix of wood smoke, animal pens, and damp wool, a signature scent of the season. Clothing was also seasonal. Linen shirts might be worn in warmer months for comfort and washed more often, while wool cloaks and tunics were layered in winter and rarely cleaned. People accepted that winter brought filth as part of life, while summer offered at least a chance to refresh and remove some grime. Even personal rituals reflected the seasons. Bathing festivals, communal washes, or trips to rivers were mostly scheduled in warmer months. Cold water dips were limited, and indoor heating made winter washing impractical. So, villagers learned to balance their hygiene efforts with weather, availability of water, and practicality, sometimes compromising heavily in favour of warmth and survival. Seasonal hygiene wasn't just about comfort, it affected health, social interactions, and even mood. Smelly neighbours were tolerated in winter, but less so in summer, when open windows and outdoor gatherings made odour more noticeable. The medieval calendar dictated not only work and worship, but also when you could wash, scrub, or simply tolerate dirt. Summer in a medieval village brought long hot days filled with work, chores, and, inevitably, sweat. Wool tunics and leather shoes didn't exactly breathe, so villagers were constantly sticky and smelly. Rivers and streams were a blessing. People washed what they could: faces, hands, and sometimes even a full body dip if privacy allowed. Children played in the water freely, often joined by pigs or ducks, creating both fun and extra muddiness. To mask the odours, herbs and flowers were essential. Lavender, rosemary and thyme were strewn in homes, tucked into clothing, or carried in small pouches. Even sweat and grime couldn't entirely defeat these natural perfumes. People also dabbed vinegar on their skin or used scented oils, believing the smells could protect against disease, a precaution against both foul odours and the dreaded miasma of sickness. Winter presented a completely different problem. Streams and rivers froze, making bathing nearly impossible. Thick layers of wool clothing trapped weeks of filth close to the body. Mud mixed with animal waste clogged streets, and cold air made outdoor scrubbing painful, if not dangerous. Villagers adapted by focusing on what could be done indoors: sweeping floors, shaking straw bedding, and burning aromatic herbs to purify the air. Even simple hand-washing before meals became a mini-ritual of hygiene in the icy months. Food preparation and storage added to seasonal challenges. Summer heat encouraged faster spoilage, requiring vigilance in keeping kitchens clean and washing hands after handling meat or dairy. Winter cold preserved food longer, but indoor smoke, unwashed utensils and layered clothing meant filth accumulated more easily. Hygiene was a moving target. What worked in July might be impossible by December. People also developed seasonal superstitions and practices. Summer festivals might include communal washes in rivers, cleansing rituals before holy days, or even playful competitions to see who could stay cleanest. In winter, superstition took a larger role. Hanging bundles of herbs above doors, burning incense, or sprinkling vinegar in corners was believed to ward off sickness, bad smells, and evil spirits. Practicality mixed with belief, creating a seasonal dance of hygiene, superstition, and survival. Even animals played a role in seasonal hygiene. Summer meant more mud and dung tracking into homes, while winter brought frozen streets that were slippery and dangerous. Cats, dogs, pigs, and chickens left their mark all year, but their impact was especially noticeable when temperatures influenced decay, odour, and pest activity. Villagers adapted, laughing at the chaos when they could, and using herbs, smoke, and sweat-soaked cloths to cope when they couldn't. Seasonal hygiene in medieval villages wasn't just about surviving day to day. It shaped the rhythm of life, routines, and even culture. Villagers quickly learned that summer demanded sweat management, river dips, and clever use of herbs, while winter required layering, smoke, and strategic sweeping to keep mud and filth under control. The year dictated when bathing, washing, and cleaning were feasible, and people adapted to these constraints with both practicality and ingenuity. Over time, these seasonal habits influenced social expectations. In summer, someone who ignored washing or failed to sprinkle herbs might be teased or shunned for their smell. Winter, however, offered excuses. The river is frozen, the mud is thick. What can you do? Humour became an essential tool for coping with the unavoidable stench and grime, from jokes about a neighbour's overgrown hair to playful commentary on a pig's latest intrusion. Even with their limited understanding of disease, villagers noticed patterns. Summer water washes helped remove sweat, grime, and pests. Winter smoke and herb bundles kept air fresher and rodents at bay. These simple seasonal practices laid the foundation for a more organised approach to hygiene in later centuries. Communities began recognising the importance of regular cleaning, planning for seasonal challenges, and sharing strategies to reduce disease and discomfort. Animals continued to play a central role. Summer meant tracking mud and dung indoors, winter meant frozen streets and harder cleanup. Yet villagers tolerated the mess because animals were vital to survival. Their close coexistence required seasonal strategies, a sort of unspoken contract between humans and their livestock that combined practicality, patience, and occasional laughter at the chaos. By balancing necessity, superstition, and humour, medieval villagers survived the extremes of each season. Their routines may seem primitive now, but they reflect a keen awareness of the environment and a resourceful approach to living with what they had. Summer sweats and winter filth were constants, yet people learned to manage, adapt, and even find levity in the mess. So when you step into your modern shower or complain about a rainy day's mud, spare a thought for the medieval villagers who faced sweltering heat, freezing cold, and an unending parade of dirt, animals, and odours, all with a sense of humour, determination, and seasonal ingenuity. Life was messy, smelly, and sometimes ridiculous, but it was survived with creativity and grit. Imagine stepping into a medieval village for the very first time. Close your eyes and inhale. But don't expect roses and pine. The smells of the Middle Ages were layered, complex, and often overwhelming. It was a mix of humans, animals, food, smoke, and waste, all mingling into a scent that would make a modern nose weep. At street level, the most immediate aroma was, well, excrement. Chamber pots emptied into the streets, pigs roamed freely, and chicken droppings were scattered across dirt paths. Manure wasn't just a nuisance, it was fertilizer for fields, so it had its purpose. But stepping over it day after day, season after season, created a baseline village stench that even the strongest herbs could barely mask. Then came the animals themselves. Dogs and cats prowled alleys, chickens scratched underfoot, and livestock contributed their own earthy musk. Pigs rooting for scraps added a particularly pungent note. Even the occasional goose or cow wandering into the market added to the cacophony of odours. Villagers accepted it as normal. After all, animals were vital to food, labour and protection. But the smell was unavoidable. Cooking and food added another layer. Smoke from open fires mingled with the aroma of roasting meat, boiling porridge, and fermented vegetables. Bread baking in communal ovens released warmth and fragrance, though the smell often competed with the pungent streets. Spices and herbs, imported at great expense, were used sparingly, so they offered only fleeting relief from the everyday odours of sweat, smoke, and animal waste. Then there was personal hygiene, or the lack of it. People bathed rarely, sometimes only once a year, depending on wealth, season, or superstition. Unwashed bodies mingled with clothing that carried weeks of sweat and grime. Fleas, lice, and other pests contributed their own tiny scent signatures, which added to the village's aromatic complexity. Interestingly, the medieval nose adapted. Villagers didn't notice the full intensity of the smells. They simply became the background of daily life. Outsiders, however, might gag or step carefully through alleys, trying not to tread on manure while holding their noses against the wind. What was normal for someone who had grown up there was offensive to a newcomer, and occasionally hilarious in hindsight. In short, the medieval village was a living, breathing scent machine, a mix of people, animals, food, smoke, and filth. Each street corner offered a new bouquet of smells, sometimes sharp, sometimes earthy, and often unforgettable. It was not a place for the faint of nose, but it was home, livelihood, and community all wrapped into one aromatic experience. Medieval villagers didn't just accept the odours around them. They actively tried to manage and mask them, often in creative and sometimes humorous ways. Herbs were the first line of defence. Lavender, rosemary, thyme, and sage were strewn across floors, tucked into clothing, or carried in small pouches to help cover the constant stench of streets, animals, and unwashed bodies. In many homes, floors were layered with straw mixed with these fragrant herbs, giving a faintly pleasant scent amid the inevitable filth. Smoke was another tool. Hearth fires were omnipresent, not just for cooking or warmth, but also for masking smells. Villagers burned wood, pitch, or bundles of aromatic herbs, filling their homes and streets with thick smoke. It wasn't exactly pleasant, but it created a sense of olfactory order in a world dominated by manure, sweat, and stagnant water. Monasteries and churches took this a step further, burning incense during rituals to purify the air, a combination of spiritual and practical thinking. Certain smells were also considered protective. Carrying nosegays, small bouquets of flowers or herbs, was common, especially during outbreaks of disease. People believed that bad air carried illness, and sniffing something fragrant could ward it off. Perfumed pomanders, scented oils, and vinegar-soaked cloths became fashionable for the wealthier townsfolk. In essence, smelling good was not just about comfort, it was about health, social status, and a touch of vanity. Humour and superstition went hand in hand. Stories circulated about neighbours whose herbs failed to mask their odours, or about pigs wandering into kitchens, spreading manure and chaos. Villagers joked, shared advice, and passed down tips for keeping smells under control, blending practicality with light-hearted coping mechanisms. Children might play near manure heaps or chase geese, while adults used herbs and smoke strategically, creating a balance between necessity and amusement. Even the streets themselves were carefully managed when possible. Some towns required that waste be swept to the outskirts, burned, or mixed with lime to reduce stench. Markets might be scented with herbs to make transactions more bearable, and festivals often included the spreading of fresh rushes on floors to mask months of accumulated filth. Hygiene in public spaces was patchy but intentional, a dance between survival, smell management, and communal cooperation. In short, medieval villages weren't helplessly smelly. They adapted using the resources at hand, blending herbs, smoke, ritual, and humour to navigate a complex olfactory world. Smell was ever-present, unavoidable, but rarely ignored. Villagers learned to manage it, survive it, and even find moments of lightness within it. Yet one might still wonder, even with herbs, smoke and nosegays, could people truly escape the relentless scent of daily medieval life? Or did they simply grow nose-blind to the ever-present symphony of smells? In medieval villages, smell wasn't just a nuisance. It was a part of culture, social interaction, and daily storytelling. Villagers quickly learned to navigate the complex aroma landscape with both strategy and humour. A neighbour's pungent home might be tolerated because it indicated wealth, livestock ownership, or a busy kitchen. A poorly managed space could become the source of endless teasing. Jokes about particularly smelly neighbours, mischievous pigs, or overzealous chickens were common and helped people endure life's constant olfactory challenges. Perfumes and herbs didn't just mask odours, they communicated status. A noble's scented robes or pomander signalled wealth and refinement, while a commoner's lavender-stuffed straw floor conveyed effort and resourcefulness. People understood that smell was both a survival tool and a social signal. In a world where hygiene was uneven and water scarce, cleverly managing odours could protect health, reputation, and relationships. Humour remained an essential coping mechanism. Tales of geese chasing priests, pigs barging into kitchens, or children slipping in muddy streets circulated from village to village. These stories made life lighter, even when smells were unavoidable. People laughed at their daily struggles, acknowledging that some odours, like a particularly stubborn pig or the lingering aroma of last week's stew, simply couldn't be avoided. Smell also influenced architecture and city planning. Streets were sometimes widened to improve airflow, windows added to help clear smoky kitchens, and communal washing areas created where water was accessible. Even the placement of livestock pens and cesspits was reconsidered, all with the aim of managing the persistent odours of daily life. In essence, medieval smell shaped both private and public life. It dictated routines, influenced fashion, inspired humour, and even guided social hierarchies. People adapted creatively, balancing survival, comfort and propriety, all while living in a world far more fragrant than our modern, sanitised environments. So when you think about the medieval village, remember, it was a symphony of smells, a mix of life, labour, and laughter. The scents were strong, constant, and sometimes overwhelming, yet they were woven into every story, every joke, and every act of survival. Villagers endured, adapted, and even found ways to laugh, proving that human resilience doesn't only survive in adversity, but can thrive even in the stinkiest of circumstances. In the Middle Ages, public bathhouses were common across Europe. They were not just for cleaning the body, but also for socialising, conducting business, and sometimes indulging in less than innocent pleasures. For a modern mind, the idea of soaking in a communal tub full of strangers might seem both adventurous and alarming, yet for medieval villagers, it was normal. Bathing, however, became a subject of moral debate. Church authorities often associated excessive bathing with vanity, lust, or sin. The reasoning was simple. Warm water opened the pores, making the body more susceptible not just to disease, but also to temptation. A bathhouse, where men and women might mingle, was viewed with suspicion. Clergy preached moderation, warning that indulgence in cleanliness could lead to moral decay. Despite this, many people continued to use bathhouses. For townsfolk, bathing was essential for comfort, health, and even reputation. No one wanted to be the villager whose stench preceded them through the market. Bathhouses offered a rare opportunity to scrub away sweat, mud, and filth, even if it meant risking moral scrutiny. The debate extended beyond morality to practicality. Medieval water systems were rudimentary, and heating large amounts of water required fuel that was costly and labour-intensive. A communal bathhouse offered efficiency. One heated tub served many, reducing the work of individual households, and yet with crowded conditions, shared towels, and reused water, hygiene wasn't always guaranteed. Bathing could both cleanse and expose villagers to germs, fleas, and lice. Interestingly, the perception of sin varied by region and era. Some towns encouraged regular bathing for health, especially in Italy and parts of France. Others, particularly in Northern Europe, adopted stricter attitudes, linking frequent bathing to decadence. People often found themselves navigating a fine line, maintain hygiene for health and social acceptance, or follow religious warnings to avoid excessive bathing. So, the medieval bathhouse was more than a place to wash. It was a stage for social interaction, a test of moral restraint, and a reflection of practical needs versus spiritual caution. Villagers balanced personal comfort, community norms, and religious instruction with each soak, scrub, or dip. Stepping into a medieval bathhouse was like entering a bustling, steamy microcosm of village life. The smell of heated water mixed with herbs, sweat, and the faint odour of unwashed bodies filled the air. Bathhouses were often segregated by time or space. Men and women had different hours, though in smaller villages this rule was loosely enforced. Privacy was minimal, towels were shared, and water was reused, making the experience both communal and slightly chaotic. For villagers, bathhouses were practical. They scrubbed off layers of sweat, dirt, and grime after long days in fields, workshops, or streets. Hot water and soap, when available, eased, muscle aches, and refreshed the spirit. Herbs like rosemary, thyme, or lavender were added to the water, masking odours while adding a touch of luxury to otherwise functional cleansing. Yet bathhouses were also sites of tension. Church leaders constantly reminded villagers that bathing could tempt sin, particularly when men and women mingled. Rumours of illicit encounters, flirtations, and scandals were widespread. Some bathhouses even had attendants, or bathers, who monitored behaviour and ensured no one overstepped moral boundaries, a kind of medieval hygiene and morality police rolled into one. Beyond morality, there were practical health concerns. Crowded tubs and reused water meant germs, lice, and skin infections could spread easily. Fleas and other pests thrived in warm, damp conditions. Villagers balanced the desire to feel clean with the risk of becoming itchy, infected, or publicly shamed for perceived impropriety. Despite the warnings, people found clever compromises. Some bathed early in the morning or late at night to avoid crowds. Others used private tubs at home, heating water over fires, if fuel allowed. Festivals, special market days, or religious holidays might see increased bathing, socially acceptable because everyone participated simultaneously. Herbs and perfumed oils became essential tools, covering the unavoidable smells of communal bathing while signalling care, wealth, and propriety. Humour and community played a role as well. Tales of villagers slipping in bathhouse water, ducks wandering into tubs, or a neighbour's accidental scandal circulated for amusement. These stories reminded people that hygiene, pleasure, and morality could coexist, albeit awkwardly, in a single, steamy room. In short, medieval bathhouses were not simply about cleanliness. They were a social stage, a moral battleground, and a practical solution to living in a world with limited water, heat, and hygiene infrastructure. Villagers navigated this complex environment with strategy, humour, and sometimes a touch of audacity. By the late Middle Ages, the bathhouse had become a symbol of both practical hygiene and cultural tension. Communities had learned that cleanliness was not just a luxury but essential for health, yet moral scrutiny and religious influence complicated matters. Villagers navigated these conflicting messages daily. Soak, scrub and refresh, but do so modestly, politely and without attracting gossip. The practical side of bathhouses left a lasting impact. People understood the importance of washing, airing clothes and managing personal odour. Herbs, smoke and scented oils became common tools, not just for masking smells, but also for maintaining social respect. Bathing rituals reinforced community routines, marking special times for cleanliness and social interaction. Even modest homes adopted elements of this culture, with basins, herbs and scheduled washing becoming part of daily life. Bathhouses also influenced social life. They were gathering places, marketplaces of gossip and venues where news travelled quickly. Discussions over tubs of warm water included local politics, trade deals or family matters. Humour helped villagers endure awkward situations. Stories of slips, overheard conversations and accidental exposure were shared and laughed at, easing tension while reinforcing communal bonds. Religion and morality continued to play a role. While church authorities warned against excess, the very existence of bathhouses suggested that cleanliness could coexist with virtue, provided it was balanced with modesty and decorum. This nuanced understanding shaped attitudes toward personal care, public hygiene, and social etiquette for centuries. Villagers learned that hygiene was not merely an individual choice, but a communal responsibility, intertwined with spiritual and social norms. Even though bathhouses eventually declined in some regions due to fears of disease or moral panic, their legacy endured. Medieval people carried lessons about hygiene into private homes, markets and festivals. They understood that managing cleanliness, odour and social perception required both creativity and cooperation. Herbs, rituals, humour and shared practices all became tools for surviving in a world where water was scarce, morality was policed, and daily life was often chaotic. So, when you think of medieval bathhouses, picture more than tubs of water. Imagine steamy rooms alive with conversation, laughter, moral debates and fragrant herbs. They were messy, social, sometimes scandalous, and ultimately a testament to human ingenuity in balancing health, comfort and culture in a world far different from our own.